Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Spotlight from Project Flux. Today we have Vijay Luthra, who is the managing partner at Seva. Vijay, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and agreeing to share some of your thoughts around AI.
Thanks, James. Great to join you, and thank you for the invitation.
Yoshi, how are you? Good to see you again.
I'm good, mate. I'm dialing in from not so sunny Wales today, so hopefully I can continue giving you the information we need.
Good stuff. Well, I'm glad to hear it's not so sunny because otherwise you'd be making me jealous. Vijay, can you, before we start and get into the interview, just for the listeners, can you tell everyone what your company does, what Seva does?
Yeah, very, very happy to, and thank you for the opportunity, James. So we're a boutique consultancy. We're focused on essentially two problems. We work in government and public services, and we work with leaders who are leading reform and transformation, and they're either just about to start or they're stuck. We find that that's the sort of problem set that most leaders need help with when they're undertaking reform and transformation of public services.
Excellent. And we know that's a very big topic, and we'll go on to AI later, and it's incredibly important because that's going to be something I feel is going to help unlock a lot of that. But you've obviously spent a long time inside government systems, and we know, and we've had people from government on the show before, we know that government systems are particularly slow to change. So what made you stay in the work of reform? Because I can imagine that it could be quite frustrating sometimes.
It can be very frustrating. And before the podcast started, we were talking about where we've been working, and Yoshi was saying he had a close brush with the Ministry of Defence, and I've spent a big chunk of my consulting career in the Ministry of Defence, and you know they're an interesting case in point in that some parts of the MOD, some parts of frontline commands, for example, will change very quickly, but other parts of the Ministry of Defence haven't changed as fast. And as we know, defence is particularly topical. The spending review yesterday has awarded a very significant increase in spending to defence, and my sense is that there'll be more of a drive for reform in the way things are done. But I guess if you're looking at where a lot of that funding has gone, it's actually gone to what some in the defence space might call legacy platforms. So, very expensive, complex, but perhaps, dare I say, obsolete systems like submarines, for example. There's an adage in defence, which is that you're always fighting the last war. And my fear is that we're perhaps not quite as quick as we ought to be to understand how the strategic landscape is changing. And that applies across public services. We do a lot of work in health, and the health space, the NHS in particular, again, had a very significant uplift in funding, although in real terms it's still not exactly what the NHS needed. But we have a sort of generational challenge around the provision of health in the United Kingdom, and in fact, a lot of the problems that we're dealing with are global. So, an aging population. The US, Canada, Japan have very similar problems to us from a health perspective. We also have a metabolic health crisis. For example, our levels of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular heart disease, rising, sort of at quite frightening levels, really. That's creating huge pressure on this key public service. The NHS in many respects is the envy of the world, but I think it's starting to lose its luster.
And sometimes just chucking cash at these issues, whether it's defence or NHS, isn't the answer. When you say legacy systems, I mean, I'm surprised. We're not talking just having a slightly old version of Windows. We're talking serious legacy, aren't we? In terms of Ministry of Defence and things like that, things that go back maybe to the 80s, because you don't want to break it because it is reliable, right? And so there's reasons why they are legacy systems, but that makes the battle even harder to upgrade. Every year that goes past, those legacy systems become harder and harder. And what we're going to talk about shortly with AI, it's going to make it very difficult to implement AI if the actual backbone, the structure is back from the 80s, or I think some cases even 70s.
I think that's completely right. I mean, there's the apocryphal story, James, of in the early noughties when the space shuttle was still still a platform of NASA engineers having to shop on eBay for parts, not specialist parts, but sort of things like floppy disk drives, for example, because that was the way the shuttle had been built, and the technical challenges of upgrading to more modern systems just weren't achievable. And I think it's sort of slightly frightening to think that some of our public services are in that state. I often remind clients when they get excited about technology, and it's great to get excited about technology, but you're invariably never implementing new tech on a green field. It's not, there's a sometimes decades of technology legacy in place. And then I think the other challenge is that in many places we don't have technology at all. I think the stat is that, and this may be surprising to some of your listeners, but again, an NHS example, 90% of NHS trusts have electronic records of one kind or another, but 10% do not, and that's a very significant number of hospitals which don't have electronic records and are still basically pushing huge trolleys of paper files around between clinics and wards. So that's hugely inefficient. It potentially creates issues around patient safety. It's it's a very significant problem.
That's mad,
and I
isn't
think,
it? You just assume all that kind of legwork has been done, but you're right, it's not. And like even just looking at something like my Apple phone, I've got an iPhone, and within it there's a health app, which some people may be aware of. It's meant to be able to link up to your NHS records. It doesn't yet, because exactly what you said. My particular hospital is probably not got everything in an electronic format, or at least not in a database that then can connect to Apple. So it's really interesting. So when you started your career, I mean, what's something that maybe you believed when we start our careers, we all go into it with high hopes, aspirations? Is there anything about how government works that you thought that now seems naive?
Well, I think I was very naive when I started my career in government, and I've been lucky enough to work in a number of different roles. So I've been a civil servant. I've also worked in regional government for the Mayor of London. I've been a school governor. I've been an elected councillor. So I've seen government and public services through a number of different lenses. My sense is I was always very ambitious for government, and I am what one of my friends would call a statist. I'm a believer in the power and the importance of the state to deliver outcomes. But I think what has disappointed me is probably the level of the cultural challenge across our public services, and this is, I think, where there's a juxtaposition between technology and culture. And I often say to my clients, again, they get excited about technology, and I say to them, well, let's park the potential of tech, and the latest trend is obviously AI. Let's park that for a minute and let's think about actually what are the changes that you need to make to your organization before you're ready for AI or other technology. And actually the biggest challenge is often cultural. We do have some very significant challenges of what you might label as inefficiency across our public services, and that creates very significant levels of challenge. For example, paper-based processes. We've just been talking about the NHS. It's the same in other public services, local authorities, for example. But we also have very, very significant levels of challenge. Going back to the challenges that our aging population poses, some of your listeners may have heard about the challenges that local government in the UK is facing. We've had waves of councils going out of business, and that's why the government at the moment are driving a wave of local government reorganisation from out of the centre, largely with an aim to consolidate councils into much bigger bodies. The idea is that a council will be responsible for about 500,000 people. But one of the biggest drivers there is around cost, and they need to be more cost efficient because of the burden that adult social care is posing on a lot of those local authorities. And some of that is because they are inefficient services. There isn't very much technology in use. But a lot of it is also because those are people-based services, and really the benefit that you can get comes firstly through getting the people to work in a different way.
Yeah, Vijay, you've described yourself as someone who's quite ambitious, and having worked in public sector, do you find your time in public sector has kind of tempered your ambition? And with that, do you find it to be quite frustrating?
And it's a really great question you pose. Has it tempered my ambition? No, it has not. I mean, I think what it has taught me is that in many respects, it's easier to try and change systems from outside rather than from the inside. And I've done both. I think it's also, if you're a political leader, it is harder to change systems than you might think. I think a lot of politicians, MPs, for example, who then become ministers, go in with huge ambition to reform and thinking that they can make a difference. And actually, it is much more difficult than you might expect. And again, the challenge I would offer is that the bulk of that challenge is in culture and behaviours. And listeners may have heard the Prime Minister talking about rewiring the state. My interpretation of what he means by rewiring the state is it's not just about technology, but it's also about culture, behaviours. I'm slightly disappointed in that we're not hearing so much about the 5 missions that the government sort of positioned as its platform for delivery when it was first elected. I actually thought that was quite a refreshing idea. The idea was that you'd break down the cross-departmental silos and point at problems in a more joined up and holistic way. It doesn't seem that that's on the agenda anymore. So yes, my reflection is that I think it's probably slightly easier to be a reformer from the outside rather than from the inside. But actually, the reality is we need coalitions of the willing to come together, people from outside, people who are inside, to be able to drive the one.
Yeah, this is really, and I think it doesn't matter who we talk to, people in government, people within large organisations. The culture piece is becoming bigger and bigger now because people are starting to realise, yes, it's there's sexy new technologies out there, but you need a good foundation to do it. And in terms of the UK government, and obviously we've got listeners from all over the world, so I'm sure it's not that much difference for our US listeners. I mean, we can't say they're not putting money in. There's the AI action plan that came out recently, and I think they're trying to address some of the fundamentals. Of course, the proof will be in the pudding. We're still early days yet. But when you look at AI from a systems perspective and like government perspectives, and bearing in mind some of the challenges we have with legacy systems, where do you think AI can genuinely improve public services?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think the potential is very significant, but my caveats would be we've got to look at it from a system perspective, as you note, and we've also got to think about the broader operating model. So my sense is we get asked to work with a lot of organisations who have tried to implement a piece of technology and it's gone wrong. Very often it's gone wrong because they've tried to bolt this tech, and latterly it's been trying to bolt on to the organisation without really thinking about the operating model for the whole organisation.
Yeah, we see that a lot.
Yeah, I applaud the ambition, applaud the desire for speed, but my view often, saying to clients, well, actually we need to slow down to speed up, and we need to go back a little, and we need to think about how do we actually take a top-down perspective of how all of the bits of the jigsaw, your people, your process, your technology, your data, how do all of those bits fit together? And then we can work out where your fancy new technology products comes in. And that applies as much to something sort of relatively simple, an ERP deployment, as it does to, putting a complex AI tool in place. In terms of potential, I mean, I think I see the immediate potential in lots of opportunity to improve transactions. So, for example, we take the Department for Work and Pensions. It runs a very significant number of processes where you're essentially analysing applications, data on people's status. And I think there's, I see significant potential to be able to make those processes a lot more efficient. PIP, for example, personal independence.
The other one's planning, that I think certainly in terms of like development and hitting the targets we want to hit. The bottleneck could be planning, and it's ripe for using AI and automation.
And it's very topical. The Prime Minister announced, I think it was only 2 days ago, that there's a new product being rolled out to local government. In order to help speed up planning process. And I think that's a great use case.
That's a real good.
And it's interesting. I think when we go back to the culture and behaviours piece, there has for a long time it's been getting steadily worse. But there's a national shortage of of planning professionals. Some of your listeners might know to be a planning officer, you need to be a member of the Royal Institute of Town Planning, and numbers of those professionals have been decreasing because people are choosing not to become.
This is the weird thing, VJ, isn't it? Because we get a lot of people worried about job displacement,
Yeah.
but we hear it time and time again. Actually, numbers are falling, so we need a bit of job display or something to come and sort of arrest those numbers somehow.
Yeah. So, like to write. I recently wrote a piece for Progressive Britain. They're a sort of think tank come membership organisation on what I call the fifth industrial revolution. We're in a time where we have this new technology coming to the fore, and it's actually not just AI. Talk about convergent technology, so it's AI, it's robotics, it's big data, it's all of those things together. I think one of the risks is if we don't take a human-centric focus, that we will end up in quite a dark place with very significant levels of job displacement. Let's move away from public services for a minute, but if you look at the creative industries, for example, there's some huge leaps and bounds being taken in production of film and TV as an example.
Music as well.
Yeah, and music. So, I think creative industries could, in 2 or 3 years' time, very, very dramatically impacted by AI. I think in public services, the interesting challenge is there's an opportunity to catch up to sort of regain to levels of productivity that we've lost. But then, yes, after that, I think we may start to see some job displacement. My understanding is more or less that the sort of more skilled, more experienced you need to be to do a job, the longer it will take to displace. So I think if you're a doctor or a surgeon, you're safer than someone who is, for example, a healthcare assistant.
Well, apparently the safest people is a plumber or a gardener.
Well, quite indeed, and people who are doing things that AI and robotics won't be able to do for quite some time. I think, but I think yes, unless we take a really serious look at how we want to shape the world, we could end up in a very challenging place indeed. Some of the numbers you see on job displacement are quite frightening, and the sort of end result of that could lead us to some pretty dark places.
VJ, when you spend a lot of years in digital transformation, and kind of a lot of people's North Star would be, enabling predictive analytics, enabling artificial intelligence. When you come to implement AI within the public sector, how far into the future of AI do you look? So, for instance, with reasoning models, right, there are a lot of risks associated with them. There's black boxes in terms of how they plan their chain of thought. When they hit AGI, can we really manage them? There are potential concerns around alignment and all these sort of things. In public sector, that carries a lot more of a risk. So when you speak within public sector and you try to drive digital transformation, how much of those concerns do you consider?
Well, I mean, I personally advocate for a long-term view. I have a view on why that often tends to be quite challenging. I think short electoral cycles is one of the challenges to political leaders thinking long term. I think also we've sort of created a bit of a pressure cooker around government and public services in that we have very very short sort of cycles of performance management. So one of my hobby horses is the way in which the Treasury sort of controls the delivery of public services in the UK. We have a very centralised public finance system in that everything flows through the Treasury. So there's no autonomy, for example, for city regions. And it would have been nice to have seen something in the spending review yesterday on that. For example, bond raising powers for West Midlands and Manchester mayors, for example. But one of the challenges of the Treasury is that they tend to be quite short term in their outlook. So, for example, we have annualised budgets when we know that complex programs of transformation, change, reform are not delivered on a year-to-year basis. So why are we saying that you've got this 12 months, then another 12 months? It doesn't really stack up. Yeah. There are some changes being made to the Green Book, but not enough. The Green Book being Treasury's mandated approach to business cases, but it's not enough in my view. And I think we need to be taking more of a long-term perspective. It is something that is difficult to discuss with clients because the people I work with, chief executives, senior civil servants, they are often under pressure to demonstrate results as quickly as possible. So they're not necessarily interested in the 5 or 10 year view because they won't be there in 5 or 10 years in many cases. So why should they care? That's rational human.
Yeah, and I think it's we're dealing with a technology when we're specifically about AI that is going to be so transformative. We can't, even though we're kind of making people make short-term decisions when really we need to be really think about the implications of some of these technologies. On the one hand, to make sure we keep up with the rest of the world within the UK, but on the other hand, to make sure we're not doing anything which is going to have serious repercussions for future generations. It's a really difficult place to be in at the moment.
It's a hugely difficult place, and I know some of your listeners are from the GCC, and I've spent a little bit of time working in Saudi and the UAE, and I'm a huge admirer of the approach that a lot of the GCC have taken to technology. They have the luxury, I'd call it a luxury, because of a different governance model of being able to take a long-term view. We could separately debate the merits of one model versus another, but there's an ambition, there's a long-term view, and there's an optimism around technology. And for example, the government of the UAE, one of the first steps that they've taken has been to create and start to roll out this huge program of training and expertise building for their senior government leaders. Now, that to me feels like a very strong, logical and way to sort of start off with bringing these technology into your government and starting with creating capability.
Training within of these kind of new AI systems you're talking about.
So I'm not close to exactly what's been deployed, but I think it's it's starting with a sort of broader understanding of what was the impact of these systems, what could they do, and then I think it's a little more focused perhaps on specific products and services. But as I say, I think it feels to me like the right way to approach this, create that capability at the most senior levels so that they can, with that mandate to think long term, can then actually say, well, we're going to take this route and not this route.
Yeah, I think it's, if you look at a country like China, right, who are, really the big threat, I suppose, to the US dominance, the advantage they have is they don't have regime change every 4 or 5 years and have to do resets. They can take that long-term view. Whatever we think about the different types of politics, put that aside for a minute. It's undoubtable that they're going to have a lot better continuity and be able to take a lot longer-term view, which is going to possibly make it, well, it's going to give them an advantage in that sense. I know, Yoshi, you've got views on that as well.
Well, yeah, because, so China come across a lot more stable in terms of their AI efforts, right? They're the ones who are driving open source mostly, and also it is a statist. It's run by the Communist Party. Just interested to hear your thoughts, Vijay, on what's happening in America then, because with the Trump-Elon Musk fallout, there's a potential divide, a fragmented AI landscape where you have Donald Trump, who is pushing more towards traditional industries, but he also has the investment within Project Stargate. And then you have Elon Musk now, who is then going to be pushing on with XAI, and he's going to be distancing himself away from that. But he has some support from the Gulf countries, right? So there's a divide there. You have, because you describe yourself as a statist, so you have Donald Trump's efforts, and they're aligned with other sort of private sector companies and Stargate, and you've got Elon Musk's approach where he's distancing himself and could cozy up with those across the Gulf. In those, what do you think might be more effective between those two different approaches?
I think it's really hard to say. I suspect that either might bear fruit. I guess my sense is, we're seeing a shift in geopolitics. Probably the biggest shift in geopolitics since the end of the Second World War.
Yeah.
China has already been on the rise for some time. People talk about this being a Chinese century, and if you talk to people in UK government, they will tell you that while Russia is the short-term national security threat, China is very definitely the medium to long-term national security threat. And, I think that the Chinese have thought very deliberately about where they want their place in the world to be. I think it helps to have the economic system that the Chinese have, where, essentially you have no division between government and the private sector. They are essentially one and the same thing. People forget that TikTok is essentially a state entity, a Chinese state entity. Whether that Chinese approach will win out over the US is difficult to say, but it certainly feels like the Chinese have the upper hand. One of the things I keep reminding people I talk to about this is that, the US is very heavily in debt. About, sort of 60 to 70, maybe even 80% of that debt is owned by China. So that puts the US in a very, very difficult position economically at the point that debt
It
comes
also,
up.
interestingly, puts America in a strong position, because if you owe someone that amount of money, they rely on you. So it's a strange one.
Yes and no. I mean, I think because, it's bonds, it's mostly bonds, and bonds have to be paid. So for the US, the challenge is the volume of debt. So, defaulting on your debt. I mean, it's a binary choice. You pay or you don't pay. And if you default on sovereign debt, then as a country, that puts you in, a very difficult position economically. It would tank the US economy. Even quite a small default would probably tank the US economy. So, my sense is it is China's century. I think Musk and Trump going to war with each other is tremendously unhelpful, but, I make no secret of my politics. I don't share my politics with Trump. So actually, if there are forces that are going to keep Trump in check, then I think that is a good thing. I hope is that in 3 years' time that the US electorate will come to its senses and elect someone who's a bit more sensible, perhaps, someone like Gavin Newsom, and we'll see the US once again taking more of a role on the global stage, and with more of a long-term perspective. But for the moment, my money would be on China.
But do you think, so in that then, do you think the UK now have a big opportunity? Because going back a few months ago, if not a year ago, there was a talent shortage within the UK because everyone was going out to America.
Yeah.
But now, because of that fragmented landscape at the moment, the UK are in a position where they can catch up. They can form new collaborations where they can drive their AI capability. Do you think the UK do have an opportunity? And if they do, where do you think they should position themselves?
Yeah, so I think there are some opportunities for the UK, and there are actually some programs ongoing to try and attract talent across from the US. We've become much more competitive as a destination as a consequence of some of the challenges in the US. And hopefully your listeners will have seen what's happening over at Harvard. The Trump administration have effectively gone to war with Harvard, and while Harvard will always have a globally recognizable name, I suspect that that conflict is probably putting people off.
Yeah, will do. 100%.
Yeah, and we're lucky in the UK. We have, I can't remember what the statistic is, but it's something like I think 60% of the world's sort of top 20 university, Oxford, Cambridge, obviously,
Imperial.
but also great institutions like King's and UCL and many others.
I think Imperial's right up there as well, isn't it? It's one of the top.
Yes,
always in the top 10. Yeah.
We've got some great world-class institutions. I think one of the limiting factors is the EU, and the Prime Minister's recognised that we need a reset in our relationship with the EU. I think my sense is a lot of people would probably put the UK second on the list after somewhere like Germany or France, perhaps, just because of that ability to be inside the EU. I mean, for life sciences, we do a bit of work in life sciences, and the Horizon programme is a pretty key source of funding for a lot of life sciences research. The UK can now take part in Horizon, but we're an associate member, so we don't get quite the same rights and privileges as a full EU member of Horizon. So yes, I think there's a huge opportunity for us. I think the other area that I'd identify is around finance and funding. London has traditionally always been a great place to raise capital. Like, it still is a great place to raise capital, but Silicon Valley remains probably the best place on earth to raise
very
capital.
hard to dislodge that.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting with the Europe thing, though, because obviously from AI perspective, a lot of companies are starting to distance the abilities that they have from being launched because of the EU Act and things like that. So Meta and Apple latterly are starting to restrict what can be done in the EU, so they comply with the EU Act. That puts us in quite a nice position, because we're kind of in between Europe and America, aren't we? So we're not being sort of faced with all the same sanctions or not sanctions, wrong words, but the same problems that the EU are facing by not having all the models available to them. At the same time, we're not fully aligned with America. When it is an opportunity, I see it as we can actually carve out our own niche.
Yes, we could do. I mean, I think we're actually a little bit behind in where we ought to be. You know, what I
In what sense, in terms of AI?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look, the bulk of the development seems to be coming out of the US, or at least the sort of bigger companies, the OpenAIs, the Googles of this world, or at least the tools that have captured the popular imagination. I'm aware, you know, that there is lots of much more specific development going on in the UK and across the EU with, you know, sort of specific use cases around life sciences and health and defence, and that's great to see. But I do think we're a little bit behind and we need to catch up. I actually suspect, and I know this is not the topic of your podcast, but I think a little bit of investment in quantum computing might well put us ahead.
You say that, but we always say that these technologies are convergent, and they're, you know, the quantum, we talk about it quite a lot, because if we can crack the quantum issue, that's going to crack the compute kind of barrier that we have, and that's also going to help manage some of the kind of sustainability concerns. So I think it is very, very linked, actually. And with what I like about the UK AI action plan is that it's not, you know, we're not trying to compete with OpenAI or Google, but we are trying to look at what are those narrower use cases where the UK can be in front. And I think actually you talked about the fact that we've got these incredible institutions. Don't forget that some of the heads of these US institutions are British.
Yes.
You know, so it's not like we're not punching. It's just that, you know, the money, like you say, it all comes through from Silicon Valley. And it all goes there. But we very much are in the game. But I do take your point that we need to be finding our place in this. And I think that's what the AI action plan is trying to do, is what are the narrow use cases where the UK can lead and take these technologies and turn them to something that really means it. So we do a lot of work in this sort of construction and really real estate sector within Project Flux. That's a lot of the listeners come from those sectors. What can we do within those sectors? And we were at Digital Construction Week last week, where you had thousands of startups. They're all leveraging this technology, US technology, or even Chinese technology with DeepSeek, but then they're building on top of that, which I find quite interesting. But that takes me to a question I do want to ask you before we go to the last segment, which is, you know, whether it's government or anywhere, one of the big pushbacks I get is, you know, well, it's an algorithm, and what happens if it makes the wrong decision? So in a government context, and particularly when you're looking at things like defence or healthcare, where it's serious, we're dealing with serious decisions, who should be accountable when an algorithm makes the wrong decision?
Well, I think in an AI technology-driven world, my sense is the role for people is critical thinking and judgment. And so, you know, we already have autonomous weapon systems that, you know, can effectively, from identifying a target through to, you know, sort of launching a munition, can do all that pretty autonomously. You have to program them to do it. But, you know, it's that capability is effectively already there. In most militaries, there is always a human in the targeting chain, though. My guess would be that will remain for many years to come. I think we don't yet have the capability to sort of make the AI as ethical as we would like it to be, and until we can do that, then humans do need to be in the loop. And then I think in sectors like healthcare, I mean, one of the reasons why I think doctors will remain with us for a long time to come, and nurses too, is that healthcare is fundamentally human to human. And while a piece of software can improve patient and clinician experience, ultimately people want that human to human experience. And if you look at, for example, some of the emerging data around ambient scribes, as in software that records a medical consultation and then writes it up for you. The expectation when some of those tools were first developed was that it would save time, and time increases productivity, because if you're a GP and your ambient scribe has reduced the amount of time you need to spend on writing up consultation notes, you can, you know, fit in 2-3 more patients per hour. It doesn't really do that, and in fact, it's somewhat facile to argue that, you know, if you save 3 minutes on each consultation, you can stitch that 3 minutes together to then get another two or three patients through the door. It doesn't really work like that. Actually, the emerging evidence seems to suggest that the thing it improves is the quality of the conversation with the patient. And we don't have data yet, but we could surmise that the long-term benefit is better care, and that is where you get the improved cost, because if people have got complications, they're comorbid, for example, I'm a kidney transplantee, I'm also neurodiverse, I also have asthma. So when I go to see the doctor, I'm a little bit more complicated than a lot of patients. And, it's a question of managing, a number of different conditions, and some of them are interdependent. We have a lot of people like that, a lot of people who have long-term conditions or more than one long-term condition. And so if we can improve the quality of their care, that will save us a lot of money and heartache.
Yeah, I was thinking about things like sort of cancer detection and things like that. Whilst we're seeing some incredible results and it's the greater good, it only takes the AI or the algorithm to miss one. Or, I guess it's not so bad to wrongly diagnose somebody with cancer and then you find out you haven't, but the other way round is terrible. And that's what someone will latch onto and then say, well, AI's done a bad thing. And you can never, I suppose, you're never going to get a system. It's a bit like the self-driving cars. We know that self-driving cars are infinitely more or safer than human-driven cars. But as soon as one has an accident, lots of people will say, well, this technology is terrible. And I'm sure the same will happen with AI in those examples, for instance, healthcare. And I guess it's just something that it'll come with the territory, and we'll just have to try and minimize it as much as possible, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in health, I think we certainly won't be able to avoid implementing AI just because, you take in the UK, for example, the elective backlog, that's people waiting for surgical procedures, which they in effect chosen to have. It's things like hip and knee replacements, for example. We need that tech to be able to help us get through it. And actually a large chunk of that backlog is diagnostic. So if we can get people through, medical imaging much more quickly, then that'll speed the whole thing up. So it is inevitable that we will have to use tools that, for example, support medical imaging. And actually, the evidence is that those, by and large, tend to be more accurate than most radiologists, and can certainly detect cancers, for example, earlier than a human eye might detect a cancer on a scan. But I think your point is well made. It'll be the exceptions to the rule that will make the news and will discourage adoption. I think it's unfortunate, but it is inevitable.
It's part of the process.
I just wanted to pick up one thing, because you are a fractional CEO at a company called Kepsoft. And that is in and around kidney transplants, and that uses an AI platform to match kidney donors to potential patients. Could you just speak to that in terms of the work you're doing and how AI is involved within it?
Yes. So we don't really refer to ourselves as an AI platform. It's a computational algorithm, so it's similar to, but not the same as AI. But we know that there's a growing problem with renal disease. It's a global problem. So the leading causes of end-stage renal disease are type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular heart disease, and those conditions, all the numbers of people with those conditions are rising.
It's scary, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, to give you some numbers, I think at the moment the NHS spends something like 10-12 billion a year on type 2 diabetes. I think by 2035 that's going to be 20 billion, so it's going to double. And then a significant proportion of those people will go on to develop end-stage renal disease, and we just won't have the dialysis capacity to be able to support all of those people. So transplantation is one of the answers. What we do at Kepsoft is we match people who need a transplant with people who are prepared to give one. It's what most people might consider altruistic donation. We tend not to use that word. We call it non-directed donation. But essentially, we are taking people who are prepared to give a kidney and matching them with people who need one. And yeah, I mean, there's a prototype version of the software is already in use with NHS Blood and Transplant in the UK. Yeah, the UK has one of the, I think, the world's largest living donor scheme, and then we're also very soon going to be deploying into a number of countries in Europe as well.
Fantastic. Sounds like brilliant work. VJ, we're coming up to the end of the podcast, can you believe? I've got one last question for you, which is a bit of a kind of out there question, a bit of a curveball question. But what's one belief you hold about work or leadership that most people would disagree with?
So I'm increasingly of the view that the role of leadership has changed quite dramatically, and this is one of the big debates that I'm trying to provoke in government circles at the moment. Is that in most countries we are, to one extent or another, fairly centralised from a governance perspective. The UK particularly so, and the challenge that brings is that we try and drive outcomes, impacts from the centre of governance. And my view would be that actually we need to be pushing delivery out much closer to the front line. In the UK, we've always tried to drive from the centre. So famously, I had the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit set up by Sir Michael Barber, which, at the time claimed some fairly significant results. But if you look at the sort of long-term impacts of what they achieved, didn't really move the dial on a lot of things. It achieved some short-term results, like better exam results. But did it actually shift the dial on people's employment prospects? No. I mean, we have 1 million NEETs in the UK at the moment, not in education, employment or training. That's, the greatest number it's ever been. So, my view, and I think politicians and senior civil servants are instinctively of the view, I need to grab everything, own it, run it, drive it from the centre. I think that's impossible to do in the complex world that we now exist in. Actually, the role of the centre of government should be to create the conditions for success, set the impact, the outcome that is desired, but then push the role of actual delivery as close to the problem as possible.
That's really interesting, because we do this kind of his whole historical hierarchy, center out, that was done for a world that increasingly no longer exists. And I think with AI is going to be even further away from what that kind of model was made for. So really, really interesting, VJ. VJ, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been incredibly interesting talking to you, and we hope you do come back on another time. Where can people find out more about you and your company?
Well, you can find us on LinkedIn. Post quite a lot on LinkedIn. I blog quite a lot, so always welcome discussion on things I post and blog. And then you can find us at www.sivaglobal.com.
Yeah, and make sure you get the right Siva, because I got the wrong one to start with. So there is another Siva out there, so make sure it's the Siva.
We're a boutique management consulting firm, not the veterinary logistics company.
Yeah, it could have been a very different podcast, couldn't it? But VJ, thank you so much for coming on. It's been incredibly interesting talking to you, and lots of food for thought there for me and Yoshi to ponder on. Any final words from you, Yoshi, before we close up?
No, I think just absolutely fascinating stuff. I mean, the level of depth we've kind of uncovered today in the public sector, and the challenges, the inertia, and all these different points. It's a lot to think about. I think our audience can take a lot away by having this more detailed insight, VJ. So thank you for that.
Very well said.
Thank
you very much. We'll see you next time, VJ.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for today's episode. But before you go, exciting news. Project Flux is teaming up with Project Management Global to bring you the latest in AI-driven project delivery and essential management insights. Through this partnership, expect weekly AI insights, practical tools, and expert thought leadership, ensuring you stay ahead in the evolving project landscape. Stay tuned for exclusive content, joint research, and strategies to supercharge your project outcomes. You can learn more at www.pm-global.co.uk and be part of the future of project management. See you later. Project Flux is here. Just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. For anyone interested in looking at Construct AI, the link's in our show notes. There's a free tier that you can play around with. Yoshi and I have been using it for a good year since it was originally launched, and we get a huge amount of value out of it. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to go onto the Construct AI site and have a play around.
Cool. And guys, before we sign off, please don't forget to share, follow, and like all of our stuff. So that helps us to engage with you and understand a bit more about what you want, so we can bring it to your doorstep as early as possible.
See you later, everyone.